Hello and welcome to this month's Breaking Barriers LinkedIn Live session. My name is Rachel Schofield. I'm one of the senior facilitators with Shape Talent, which is an award-winning gender equity consultancy supporting multinational large companies who are serious about gender equality. And every month, I invite you to join me and my guests in a conversation about some of the big topics, the important topics in the world of gender equality. We've had so many interesting guests from far and wide, but today we're going a little bit closer to home, and I'm joined by two colleagues, our CEO and founder, Sharon Peake, and our Director of Research and Product Innovation, Dr. Priscilla Pereira. Hello, both.
Hello.
Hello, nice to be here.
And the reason that we've done this is because today's session is going really granular. We've called it 5 game-changing tactics to accelerate gender equality in your organization. And Sharon and Priscilla are here because, along with me, we do this stuff all the time, and we constantly get a series of questions and concerns, challenges from our clients that come up time and time again. So we wanted to distill those into 5 challenges, really, that we can unpick, that we can go really deep on, so that we're not just talking about the big picture, the why, but we're talking about the how you move forwards in approaching gender equality in your organization. So we're going to walk through 5 scenarios, in effect, and Sharon and Priscilla are going to bring their experience, success stories from clients, really kind of lived experience of the work that we do and the results that we see, to show you what's possible and to give you actionable takeaways for your own organization. So we will have a chat for about 25 minutes and hopefully have enough time at the end to just have a few moments of questions, aiming to wrap up after about half an hour. So it'll be short, sweet, but it will give you some really juicy stuff to take away. So Sharon, I'm going to start with you. Scenario number 1, tactic number 1. The C-suite, the CEO. We know that when we work with clients, one of the first questions that we are curious about is your senior leadership team on board with this? Is your CEO in a position where she or he gets it and wants to work on gender equality? Why is this still so important, and how do we move forward if the actually what's coming back is, well, they sort of are, they're saying the right things, they're making the right noises, but we're not convinced?
Yeah, great question. And it's a really interesting time to be asking this question, of course, because there is some sense of progress having stalled. I mean, that's the reality. That's what the data is telling us. And I think there's a couple of things that are going on at C-suite that we're observing around this. Firstly, I think there's a lack of awareness that progress has stalled. And secondly, I think there's a level of fear. So some of our audience might be familiar with the research that was done recently by Ipsos in conjunction with King's College London. They interviewed people in 31 countries, and basically half the population think that we've ticked that box when it comes to gender equality. They think that we're there. And of course, the reality is that we're not. If you look at the World Economic Forum data from this year, we're still 4 or 5 generations away from achieving gender equality. So I think there's this societal misconception that we've done that, we can take our foot off the pedal. So I think there's that element. The other thing that we see going on in big companies is a real sense of fear in the exco. So fear of misstep, of saying the wrong thing, of doing the wrong thing, of maybe some fear of public ridicule as a result. So I think I think that's real. And I think kind of EDI practitioners, chief people officers need to kind of realize that and recognize that. And so there's maybe 3 things that I would say are really important if you're working with the C-suite to really help them on this journey. And the first thing is to meet them where they're at. So understand, what are their drivers? What kind of matters to them when it comes to gender equity? For some, it will be easy. It will be an intrinsic motivator. It will be just, a sense that this is the right thing to do. But for others, it might be more of an extrinsic motivator. Maybe they've got pressure from the board, investors, consumers, employees. Maybe they're struggling to find talent. Maybe they're worried about the reputational risks of falling behind. Because let's face it, there's a lot of public data now on gender and gender representation. So if you are falling behind, it is in the public domain. So meet people where they are, recognize what is their motivation around this topic. The second thing would be to contract with your executive team, contract both as a group and individually. So we do a lot of work with executive teams where we will work with both the group and individuals. We will have a conversation to clarify what is their collective aspiration around gender equity. Do they want to be a leader of the pack? Do they want to be somewhere in the middle? What are they trying to achieve and why? Everyone will be somewhere on the continuum, but collectively, what are they committing to? And then one-on-one working with people to contract about what they will do. And then the final step is kind of once you've ignited people, once you're speaking their language about their drivers, then you've got to move really quickly. So once you've got a sense of momentum, you've got to work with people one-on-one to help them see what actions they need to take. What are the next steps that they can take to bring this to life in their function or their business area, whatever their area of responsibility is? What do they need to be doing and saying to bring this to life?
Brilliant. Thank you, Sharon. And I should say, please use the chat. Tell us what's resonating. Do take notes, because as I say, we're really wanting to give you nuggets that you can take away and start actioning straight away. So if you have a question, a follow-up question on something that we're saying, or you just want to kind of reflect that, yes, you're aware of this in your organization, you want some help, we would love to hear that from you. Okay. Game-changing tactic number 2. Priscilla, I'm coming to you on this one because Priscilla is our data, I was going to say geek, that sounds hard, but data is your thing. And data is something that gets bandied around a lot in the space around gender equality. We know how important it is, but here's something that I know we see that happens is we start working with a client who says, we've got some data, we've done lots of surveys, we've got some data, here it is. So we sort of know the lay of the land, but actually what we see is that sometimes people are using data in a way that doesn't fully serve their actual needs. So tell us more about the power of data in prioritizing the right kind of initiatives that are going to have the impact that people actually want.
Yes, that's a great point, Rachel. So when we think about data and impact, we like to look at data in 3 categories. The first one is strategic data. The second one is progress data. And the next one is employee experience data. Let me use a client to illustrate each category for you. So if I think about strategic data, so strategy is always about the future, where are you heading, but also what is happening outside the organization that might change your ability to get where you want to get. Will be things about what is happening with the business itself. So not just within your strategy, your gender strategy, but with the business. Have you got any restructures happening, for example? Because restructures, they are great. They can really advance gender equity, but sometimes and most times they can represent a risk, because we know that problems around women not having enough sponsorship, for example, or not being able to access informal networks. That means when you're appointing people internally, might be that women, they are not going to have a fair competition, if you like. So there are things that we need to consider, and that would be things as well outside the business. Yeah. So what is happening? Have you got any legislation coming up, or have you got any industry regulations, or what is happening with the competitors? So if I go back to the client that I mentioned, at the very core of the strategy for this client, we had a target that was 40% female and 60% male for the senior leadership roles in the period of 3 years. So the data that we want to look at then is, what is your turnover for the last 3 years? And if you project that, are you going to have enough seats to make this promise? And if you do have enough vacancies, do you have enough women lined up, or enough members from minoritized genders to be able to compete fairly? And then once again, what is the restructure happening? Have you thought about the restructure? And through this process, then one of the things that we have done was, first of all, align the gender strategy with the business strategy. This is so important, and a lot of organizations, they miss that. And then we have issues with the restructure. For example, it's very important to have gender impact assessments in place if you have a restructure, to avoid you regressing in terms of your achievements. But we also added gender bias, gender proportionality targets, because it's very important for you to have a very healthy pipeline throughout the career levels. So that is about strategy data. Then if I move to progress data here, there will be two things. Your KPIs, that would be your micro targets that will make sure that will get you to the bigger target, if you like. And will be also evaluations of programs to make sure that whatever you're doing, you are meeting your desirable outcomes, and you have projects that they are well scoped and you don't need to change course. For this particular client, they had beautiful programs, but the problem was they are just not doing enough. They are probably addressing 20% of their gaps. And the reason for that is because they're not getting the budget that they need. And when we're talking about KPIs, we do say, don't we, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. And you could say what doesn't get measured doesn't get money either. So by introducing KPIs for this client was great, because then they start securing more budget and they could carry on and do more stuff that they had planned. And the last one is about the employee experience data. And this is an important sort of data, because you have got two situations here, really. You have got one, first of all, imagine that you have the dominant group here. You need to accelerate the minoritized group to make sure that they can compete fairly. But once the race starts, just starting from the same line is not good enough. You need to constantly be understanding what barriers you have here for just competition to be fair, so you can remove them. And most data dashboards from EDI point of view, they don't specifically address that. So the competition is still unfair. So for this client, for example, they use engagement surveys, and we recommend that with engagement surveys, they have their purpose, but not in the EDI space. This is because it's not unusual for minoritized groups to score high engagement, because they have very strong career resilience. If you think, they are working environments that has not been designed for them to succeed, so they cannot afford not to be engaged. So the result here is not going to give you much. And then we moved to look at the inclusion surveys that they had, which is fine. Once again, and we believe that is important to have inclusion surveys, and some inclusion surveys, they are better than others. However, if we stop for a second and we think how we design inclusion surveys, we design thinking once again about the dominant groups, thinking about the majority of the employees, and we just hope that the minoritized groups, they will fit in. And we do that with everything, don't we? We do that when we design surveys, we do that when we design products, when we design services. And there is an implication here. If I just give you a practical example, one of the things that perhaps we would measure when we're looking at inclusion will be a question around, do I feel safe? We know that minoritized groups, they have laws to protect them, because it's not easy for them to feel safe. So what it takes for them to be safe is going to be very different from what would it take for someone in a dominant group to feel safe. It's the same thing with another question like, do I feel heard? Why do we think that we have ERGs and networks? Because what is needed is different. So what we are saying is, keep the instruments that you have. However, you need to embed within your feedback loop something that's specifically designed and is based on the science that we know that addresses minoritized groups. So for these clients, what they have done, they have embedded focus groups as an integral part of the feedback loop. But it doesn't need to be focus groups. Can be other surveys, can be other diagnostics, as long as they have been designed with the minoritized group in mind.
Yeah, I love that. So realizing there's not just one kind of data, there are three kinds of data, and there needs to be real nuance. And I love the example that you brought there. Thanks, Priscilla. I see Sharon nodding as well. I'm going to stay with you for a minute, Priscilla. We've talked about the importance of getting the C-suite on board and how you do that. We've talked about the power of data and the right data. I want to ask you about how you really embed gender equity into your organization's DNA. We work with clients who really, want to do this, but there is a sense sometimes that it's sort of the icing on the cake, or it's a sort of, we've sort of done that and it just sort of sits on the side and it doesn't really permeate more deeply into an organization. That's a hard one, isn't it? To really kind of make that cultural shift. What have you seen in this space about what's going to work well? And I imagine it's not a speedy process.
No. And when I think about culture and gender, equity, I think about the social structures around gender, how we define gender. And we are exposed to the social structures inside work, but outside work as well. So even companies that they have very progressive cultures, they have hit the targets, it's so easy for them to regress if they don't have efforts aimed at maintaining their results. And this is because those just cultures inside work and outside work, they're always kind of talking to each other, if you like. We're always exchanging how we feel about things. But there are three specific things that I can think of when I think about culture. The first one is how we engage in men. So most companies, they're using allyship programs. And we know that there is evidence to show that allyship programs, they work. But my question here is does that work for every man or for the majority of men? If we pause here for a second and we think about what we are trying to do, we are trying to reform the definitions of gender. We are trying to reform the meaning and transform what gender is and the stereotypes. So the same way that women, they have their own things to deal with in terms of stigmas, men will have some stuff as well that they need to go through. So if you think about some of the stigmas around the breadwinner, the ideal worker, masculinity, hypermasculinity. So for a lot of men to go from that, I'm dealing with my own stuff, to just a second, I'm going to be an allyship, is a massive jump, and they are just not ready. So when we look at outside the corporate world and we think, okay, there is a gap here clearly. So who is doing that well? And we look at the international development sector. They have some beautiful gender transformative programs that create this space where men, they can work through their own stigmas and then be ready to then understand the benefits for all the genders and to become an ally. And if we don't bring that, and that's something that at Shape Talent we're doing, if you don't bring that to the corporate world, some of the consequences might be performative allyship, or even kind of we might nudge some of this anti-gender sentiment because we're not creating that space for them to work through these things. Then the second thing that I would say about culture is developing a risk management mindset when it comes to bullying, harassment, discrimination. I did mention that we have laws to protect minoritized groups and women and minoritized genders because we know that they are at greater risk of bullying, harassment, discrimination. And the statistics always surprise me because I think, okay, in the Western we are better than actually we are. And it always disappoints me. So for example, if you look at in the UK, 1 in every 3 women, they experience sexual harassment in the workplace. So sometimes I wonder, what would it take for us to prevent, like the same way that we deal with health and safety, that we're very good at identifying data and identify where the risk areas are and preventing it. And when the incident happens, use a lot of knowledge from the incident to kind of inform prevention again. Because when you ask companies, for example, what are your departments that are at greater risk of bullying, harassment, discrimination, they don't know. Or they will be looking at data from formal claims. But a lot of employees, they are not going to follow a formal claim because they don't want their peers to be fired, for example. They just want the behavior to stop, or they will not trust the system either. So something as basic as anonymous reporting, that's best practice, you would be surprised how many companies they don't have that in place. And the last thing I would say is think about critical mass, particularly from a risk management point of view. There is some work from Santola, from the University of Pennsylvania, that suggests that there is a tipping point where minorities within the system, they need to have a certain number of people there to still be able to influence the system and to be heard. And that's 25%. So it's 1 in 4. So if you use the critical mass theory, for example, it's easier for you to understand, okay, what are my departments, my countries, my career levels, where I don't have this minimum representation, that I know that this person or the 2 people that I have in a group of 15, they will need support and allyship. So those are the 3 things that I would consider when we're thinking about culture.
Thank you. I'm visualizing people rapidly scribbling all of this down. And actually, it's worth me saying, don't forget our back catalogue of LinkedIn Lives, because you were talking there about allyship and the role of men and the challenges that men face that we shouldn't overlook. And we did 2 great LinkedIn Lives back in February with Robert Baker and in March with Lee Chambers. So if your ears are pricking up and you want to hear more about allyship and how this whole debate affects men, do go and have a listen to those as well. In the meantime, Sharon, I'm going to come to you for game-changing tactic number 4. And this one's really interesting because at Shape, we do a lot of work internationally. I was thinking, I've got a coaching session this afternoon. I was looking at the people who are in it. They're from Ireland, Brazil, Canada, the UK, and that's not uncommon, of course. Big multinational organizations are straddling lots of different countries. And so global implementation, how do we ensure successful global implementation of DEI policies when you've got countries who are at different maturity levels, you've got different cultural norms or legal frameworks? It's complex. So tell us about some things that we ought to be thinking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And of course, as you say, it applies to pretty much any organization that works across borders. Most of our clients being multinationals, we're well familiar with this challenge. I mean, I think the adage of think global, act local is really important here. And there are 4 things that we tend to advise organizations that we work with as they're navigating these challenges. As you say, different countries will have different regulatory frameworks. They have different cultural needs, different cultural priorities. So the 4 things we say are set some minimum expectations based on kind of international evidence. Make sure your framework is flexible enough to be tailored and co-developed locally. Think about your brand, what you want it to represent, and then also think about your whole ecosystem. So go beyond employees. And maybe I can elaborate a little on each of those. So the first one is setting minimum expectations that apply everywhere. So this is hard. It depends where you operate, but have a think about what's important to you. There are some great free tools out there, by the way, for any organizations listening that aren't already familiar with the UN WEPs, the Women's Empowerment Principles. If you sign up to the WEPs, there are some free tools and resources that take into account international evidence that you can use to navigate some of these challenges. But let me bring it to life with a very practical example. This is something IKEA did a couple of years ago. They looked at their recruitment processes and they made one change, a small but very powerful change to their recruitment processes in every country around the world. And that is they removed the question of what is your current salary, or what was your previous salary for someone who's applying for a new job. Now, this is incredibly powerful. And I just want to pause here for a moment to elaborate on this. This is one of my pet peeves, as the 2 of you will know already. For anyone listening that currently has that question in their recruitment processes, I know it's still baked into a lot of applicant tracking systems that I look at. It's often a mandatory question. What was your previous salary? For anyone who's doing that, please stop now, would be my request. And the reason for that is by asking that question, you are perpetuating gender pay gaps. So let me explain that. We know that women are paid less than men, and they're paid less than men for 2 reasons typically. One, because they're in more junior roles or lower paid roles than men, or because they're doing the same job or work of equal value, but they're paid less, which is unlawful in many countries around the world, but it still happens. So these 2 factors mean there are gender pay gaps in most countries around the world. And if you anchor the salary that you pay your new recruit to something they were paid previously, and if that payment was underpaid, you're simply perpetuating the problem. So don't ask, what were you paid?
I think we're losing Sharon a little bit there. Let's. I think the dreaded Wi-Fi may have.
Salary.
I think. Are you back with us, Sharon? Priscilla, why don't you unmute there?
Again?
I think you're back. Sorry, we just didn't catch the last kind of minute or so there.
Okay, so I was saying that if you ask the question about what is your previous salary in a recruitment process, if it's in your applicant tracking system, you are perpetuating gender pay gaps because women are paid less than men, either because they're in lower paid roles or because they're paid less for doing the same job. Unlawful, but it happens. So remove that question, replace it with what are your salary expectations? So that was a simple thing that IKEA did globally. That was an international standard, and I would implore every multinational listening to do the same thing. So that's number 1 out of the 4 tips. The second tip is make sure your frameworks are flexible enough to accommodate differences. So, for example, if you're in the US, your priority might be around intersectionality and anti-racism for women. If you're in Asia, it might be about accelerating women into leadership roles. So you're going to have a different flavor and different priorities in your EDI strategies, depending on where you are. The third thing is think about your brand internationally. What do you want to stand for? What's really important? What are the minimum standards that you want every country to be adhering to? And then finally, think about your whole ecosystem. So not just employment. I'm here at a conference, which is why I've got bad Wi-Fi today. I'm at a conference in Paris. I've spent the last 2 days listening to big organizations, global employers talk about their supply chains, their procurement functions, companies like AstraZeneca, Dow, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, to name a few. They are looking at where they procure services from. They ask their suppliers their diversity and inclusion profiles. They ask their suppliers, tier 2 suppliers, what their profiles are. Some of them have targets around the amount of minimum spend, the amount of spend that they target for underrepresented groups, including women-owned businesses. So look across your whole supply chain to make sure that it's not just employees you're looking at, but how you procure services and also how services are distributed as well.
Brilliant. And I'm glad you're back with us. Just to say, before I come to our last game-changing tactic, thank you for those of you in the comments. Hello to Sarah. Glad you like the distinctions. Jen, if we have time, I'll get to your question. And hi to Mika as well. Somebody asking, can we get that UN tool link, please? We'll put that in the comments. Sharon, whether that might be just after we finish, but of course you can always go back. This sits on LinkedIn afterwards. You'll be able to get access to all the comments and rewatch things, share it with colleagues or friends as well. So yeah, absolutely.
And just to jump in there, if you Google the WEPs, Women's Empowerment Principles, UN WEPs, you'll be able to find those tools. You'll need to sign up to the WEPs.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sharon, for that. So final game-changing tactic is around metrics. We've called it metrics that matter. Because all of this, of course, we're working with businesses who have a bottom line and they want to know that there's an ROI on their gender equality efforts. They want to think, is this working? Are we making progress? And when you've got lots of different metrics and data, how do you get to grips with that, Sharon? How do you really feel like we're doing this right?
Yeah, look, I'm going to take this to a macro level. And maybe if I start by saying there are 2 things that we need to do if we want to achieve gender equity and ultimately gender equality. We need to simultaneously remove the barriers that women face in their careers. Our research tells us, lots of other people's research tells us there are barriers women face, whether it's discrimination, whether it's the double burden of paid and unpaid work, with lack of development opportunities. We've got to remove those barriers. And at the same time, we've got to accelerate women into leadership roles so they can start to influence how systems are designed. So if they're the 2 things that are needed to achieve gender equity, then there's 2 kind of higher order metrics, I think, that really matter here. One is measuring how well you as an organization are addressing the barriers to women's career progression. We have a diagnostic tool that does exactly that. It can pinpoint very specifically by function level, any kind of demographic that you want, any context that you want, where the barriers are. Are they happening in recruitment? Are they happening in meetings? Are they happening in performance management? Are they happening in salary reviews and negotiations? So where are the barriers happening? And then measure that year on year as to how much progress you're making in dismantling those barriers. And then the second higher order metric is representation. So look, measure representation of women in leadership, but do it at different levels. And Priscilla mentioned a really nice tool for this, the gender proportionality principle by Siri Chalazi and some other Harvard researchers. It gives very practical guidance on how do you set representation targets at different levels of the business that are both stretching but also realistic and fair. So they're the 2 things I would recommend.
Wonderful. I think before I wrap, we have time for just one of the questions that has come in. This is from Jen, who's actually a colleague, but this is fantastic because it's about communication, really. We've talked a lot about the practicalities. I hope we've given people lots and lots of juicy insights and actionable guidance. But Jen asking, how do you gently or not, Sharon, give awareness to the C-suite leaders that you're engaging with when you're dealing with some quite dramatic statistics and get that buy-in when, you know, you're having to tread in a way with diplomacy and kind of really engage people. So how do those conversations look, I wonder, day to day?
Yeah, well, I think they need to be authentic is perhaps my opening point here. And I don't think you can shy away from the hard data. So one of the things that we often do with organizations is we'll run focus groups as part of a diagnostic as we begin work with them, focus groups or a diagnostic survey, and we collect voice of the employees. So when you've got sometimes really hard messages from employees around their experience in the workplace, the sort of things that the exco don't know about, they're not hearing about in their day-to-day conversations, they don't know what's happening. And it happens in the most kind of evolved and mature organizations, I might add. But once you've got that data, it's playing it back. So it's playing it back in a way that is meaningful for them and not filtering it. I think I always lean into the tough conversations because they have to be had if you want to raise awareness. But again, you've got to meet people where they're at. You've got to recognize where they are individually at the journey and their readiness to hear some of the messages so you can present it in a way that is meaningful and relevant to them.
Wonderful. Thank you to both of you. We are at time. I can see another request has come in for a tool. We will absolutely engage in the chat. If you had a question that we haven't got to, then please drop it into the chat. Sharon and Priscilla are both very happy to be contacted on LinkedIn, or certainly will engage in the chat there. And what we really wanted to do today, and I hope we've succeeded, I think we have, was to kind of lift the lid on the kind of work that we do day to day, to give you the insights you need, to give you some of the strategies that we use that you can now take away into your organization. So I guess my challenge, as you are listening to this, whether live or on replay, and do drop in the chat if you listen on replay and say hello, is to say, what are you going to go away and do today? What is one action of the many tips and tricks that you have had from these game-changing strategies that you could action? And for some of you, you'll be like, great, I've got so much to go on here. I'm going to go away and start playing with some of this stuff in my organization. If it's given you a taste and you're thinking, but I still need a little bit more help or guidance, then of course, reach out to Sharon, reach out to Priscilla. We'd be delighted to support you further. And just finally, I would like to flag that next month, our LinkedIn Live happens on October the 15th. It coincides with World Menopause Day. So Sharon and also Anne Hayes from the British Standards Institution, who are doing some really interesting work around menopause and menstruation, and Lynn Bartholomew from Ericsson will all be here with me to talk about the whole issue of menopause in the workplace and how best we support women and how we create standards and frameworks and good practice to make sure that women can still thrive at whatever stage of their life. So do look out for more posts on that, emails on that, and get it in your diary for October the 15th. And we're delighted you were able to join us. Thanks again, Sharon and Priscilla. We'll give you a little wave and say cheerio.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.